Okay.
Yep.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Matthew Schwartz, Group Editor of PR News, and welcome to our online seminar, Meaningful Metrics, Understanding Engagement, Influence, and Impact. This 1 hour-long webinar is sponsored by PR News and CARMA. PR News is a weekly newsletter covering corporate communications and public relations, and we also have an events and online platforms as well. And CARMA is a global media analysis company that focuses on linking PR outputs with business incomes. Hosting our webinar this afternoon is Jim Macnamara, Professor of Public Communications and Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Technology, Sydney. Jim is a 30-year public relations veteran. After founding and heading a top PR and communications consultancy for 13 years, he founded the Asia-Pacific office of media analysis firm CARMA in 1995 and headed the firm until 2006. He is an internationally recognized for his evaluation of PR, and he's also the author of 12 books, including The 21st Century Media Revolution. Jim, take it away.
Well, good morning all. Nice to be here, and particularly to talk about measurement. It's something that we've all been lectured about and told about for probably nigh on 20 or 30 years. And a lot is happening around the world in measurement at the moment. You may have heard a bit about some of the development of standards. Today I'm particularly going to zero in, though, on some of the higher level issues, engagement, influence, and impact. Something we hear a lot about is not just measuring our outputs, as they use that term, the press releases, the publicity, the events, but increasingly we've got to, for business, we've got to looking at a higher level of understanding the engagement, the influence, and the impact that it has on the organizations or the business outcomes. So I thought I'd just stick off with a photograph that certainly speaks of engagement, influence, and impact. I think when you look at this, you can see pretty clearly that there's an engagement happening here between this giant aircraft carrier and a couple of small protesters' boats. Is there influence? Well, it's pretty obvious that the aircraft carrier by sheer size has influence, and there may be about to be impact. So it kind of looks cutesy and easy, and we sometimes think that engagement, influence, and impact, these are things that we'll know them when we see them. And to some extent that's true. But the other thing this photograph allows us to think about is those small boats, those handful of protesters, they also had influence. They had significant influence on nuclear policy around the world. They had significant impact on governments, on the armed services, on fishing boats around the world, and so forth. So things like engagement and influence and impact are sometimes easy to see, but they're also much more nuanced and sometimes more hidden and more complex, and therefore difficult for us to evaluate. In the broad picture, and I'll just quickly mention a little bit of background, is that it's a good time to talk about measurement, because around the world right now there's sort of a renewed focus. We've been talking about it a long time, but there's now been an international standards initiative really kicked off in 2011 when the IPR, the Institute for PR in the US, and the Association for Measurement and Evaluation, headquartered in the UK but globally, and the Council for PR Firms got together and said, let's form a coalition for public relations research standards. Let's try and set some standards to end the confusion and to get some standard terminology and so forth. That gathered momentum in 2012 when the coalition members, those initial three, particularly looked at social media standards where there was very little standards, and they then also expanded that group to another 8 PR organizations worldwide. So in addition to those first 3, we had the Global Alliance and the PRSA, the CIPR in the UK, the IABC, and you're starting to see a fairly major rise in momentum. And one of the exciting things was groups like WAMA, the Word of Mouth Marketing Association, and the Digital Analytics Association. We started to work with those groups not just to talk among PR professionals, but to try and look at the whole corporate and marketing communication space and get some sort of standardization. We also know that we've got to work with clients, and one of the things that this group worldwide has been doing, not only 11 PR organizations and communication organizations, but 8 major companies have been involved to make sure we have a client perspective and that these things can work. And following on from what I just said before, they've also, not part of the group, but this coalition has worked really closely with the Media Ratings Council, the advertising industry bodies, the Web Analytics Association. So there's a real coming together worldwide to say, look, right across the corporate and marketing communication space, we can do things slightly differently, we can customize to our needs, but we've got to use at least standard terminology. When we say impressions, it should mean the same thing, for example. And we've seen both the US and the European measurement summits in the last 3 years really focusing on this area. So that's just a bit of background. What are we developing standards for? And today we're going to focus on 3 of these, the 3 higher level, but just to give you the 6 main areas. The first basic level they've started at is looking at content sourcing and methods. And already there's been a couple of standards published there, and I've put a web address on the slides. You can go to a website and get a copy of these. But at the first level, we've got to source our content in a transparent and open way. If you're doing media content analysis, for example, where do you get your sample from? Are you analyzing everything, or is it a selection? And if it's a sample, social science research methodology demands that we are transparent about how we selected that sample. The methodology we use, how are we going to code the articles, etc. And there's been in the PR industry too much black box type approaches where it's always secret algorithms, and that really costs us credibility. You don't have to divulge certain parts of proprietary systems, but certainly the basic methodology, the basic processes, it's fairly standard in social science to be transparent with that. The second level is dealing with a whole lot of language. Reach, impressions, just to name 2. It's really in around, I won't go through this today, but around the industry between advertising and direct marketing and online and PR, the word reach is used to mean different things. Impressions is sometimes readership, sometimes it's circulation, sometimes it's just the circulation, sometimes it's circulation multiplied by the number of articles. So there's all of these variations, and when you look at it, who could blame clients for being absolutely confused by this? So these are the kind of things we're looking at. The purpose today, though, is this is all happening as we speak. These standards are being developed. There's a lot of consultation happening. If you want to get involved in the discussions, you can. I know these organizations are welcoming members to get involved. But the next couple of biggies, these are what I'd call the biggies. And we're just now starting to look at what do we mean by engagement? What do we mean by influence? And the influence has got to be relevant. There's also some work being done on opinion and advocacy, things like tone, messages, sentiment, and I'm not going to talk too much about that today, but we can touch on it. But then finally, the really big one is what is the impact on the business or the organization and the value that PR and corporate communication has. So the purpose today was sort of to situate this and say, this is the standards movement that's happening. The most complex and the higher level ones are engagement, influence, and impact and value. And there's still not a huge amount of understanding of those. So I'm going to chat a bit about each of those. I'm going to talk about engagement first, and then we might stop and have some discussion or questions, and then move on to the others.
And Jim, before you continue, if I could just interrupt for a moment, I was remiss in telling attendees that we'd like to make this webinar as participatory as possible. So if attendees have any questions, if they'll look on their screens to the right-hand side to the chat box, and if they could insert their questions, but be sure and hit send afterward. Otherwise, their questions will not go through. Jim?
Yeah, we welcome your questions. Down the bottom of that panel, there's a little vacant screen to type messages. Don't forget, as Matt says, there's a send button right in the bottom right-hand corner. Matt's keeping a close eye on that, so am I, so we'll try and answer questions if they come in. Okay, engagement. And this is a really interesting one. I'm going to spend a bit of time on this. First of all, at a basic level, engagement is something that happens after our outputs are distributed. So we're not taking away from the fact that we've got to produce publicity and press releases and generate coverage. We've got to distribute brochures or stage events. They're what we call our outputs. But at some point, having done that, we want engagement to occur. Engagement's important because if our audience don't even engage with the information we're putting out, it doesn't go any further. There's no chance of an outcome. They've got to be engaged in some way. And you could, if you like, classify engagement as probably an outtake. It's between the outputs we produce and the outcome that we ultimately want to create. It involves some kind of interaction between the organization and one or more stakeholder groups. And we'll talk about what that sort of interaction is. But definitely it's an interaction. Engagement's not a state of mind. They've actually got to do something. Importantly, it's qualitative as well as quantitative, because we've got to recognize that engagement could be negative. People could get engaged and say they don't like something or protest about it. So we're kind of interested in interaction, but we're interested in positive interaction. We're interested in affirming interaction. The other important thing, of course, is, and I'm sure we all know this, is engagement is going to occur offline and online. Even if you're running an online campaign, and this is tricky, is the engagement may actually occur offline. The photo I'm just throwing up here was a campaign that began on social media. It was a protest in South America. But then, in addition, students and others took to the streets, and I kind of love the photograph. It sends a wonderful, iconic message that most people around the world can understand. But this was an interesting case where there were things happening online and you didn't see any engagement, but then suddenly things were happening offline that were triggered by it. Sometimes you get something happening offline and you're not sure, when you go online you see a lot more engagement there. So we've kind of got to take an integrated approach to looking at engagement, knowing it's interaction, it's offline and online, it's qualitative, it's positive and negative. Now here's kind of the problem with engagement, and this is where I sort of get on my high horse a bit. The advertising industry is worse than the PR industry in calling engagement or identifying engagement with a number of very simple things. You'll hear visits, page views, you'll even hear click-throughs, and they'll measure that and describe it as engagement. Now, if you say that to a psychologist or someone where the concept of engagement comes from, they'll roll their eyes, because these things can be important. We're not dismissing them, but in psychological terms, they're fragments of behavior. They're small fragments. If someone clicks through a page, are they really engaging? Well, at a very low level, maybe, but they might click through and actually hate what they see and then just move away. Or they may just do it out of mild curiosity. We all know that people like things on Facebook or follow purely out of curiosity. And if you like, these are things that are on the way towards engagement. But the caution I'm sounding is when we talk about engagement, it has to be more than low-level basic click-throughs or retweets or sharing or liking or simply a page view. So let's move on and look what is engagement. And without getting sort of too academic or heavy, I think it is very, very important for practitioners to understand what engagement is. It's actually a psychological concept, and one of the definitions talks about engagement involves some sort of passion, some sort of commitment, an investment of oneself in discretionary effort. It's kind of when you get off your chair or you get onto your computer or you actually do something in response to messages and information. These 3 points are probably the key. And this is a great test, and I'm going to show you a model in a moment that really is useful for generating and showing outcomes. Psychologists tell us there are 3 vital elements of engagement, and if you don't have these 3, you probably haven't got engagement. At a first level, there's got to be some sort of psychological connection. Now, that may be rational. So the first level, engagement might be based on rational thinking, on information you provide, an experience you provide. That's very common. We send out information all the time. The next 2 are not so common. In addition to that sort of basic level of connection, engagement involves some level of emotional involvement. And the advertising industry is fairly good at this, as they understand that you've got to tap people's brain, their thinking brain, their cognition, but you've also got to tap their emotions in some way, and that's when you start to really get rubber to the road. In addition to that, there's a third element, and psychologists say that not only do you have to sort of tap the cognitive level and the emotional level, they use the term empowerment, but the main way what they mean by empowerment is participation, allowing the stakeholders to participate in some way. Now that's this is a really, really key one because it then leads us towards, well, what do we think engagement will look like? And the way to test it is you can run a little checklist. Have you got some sort of cognitive engagement? Are people reading your messages or coming to your events? Is there some level of emotional involvement? And are you giving people the chance to participate? In very simple terms, we know that when people participate and get active in something, they are more deeply engaged, and that's more likely to lead on to behavior. Let me quickly share with you this model that really, this is something that sort of blew me away when I first understood it. And it basically, it just shows where engagement fits and ultimately how we generate behavioral change. Because at the ultimate level, just jumping ahead for a moment, we want to create outcomes, and usually they are behavior. Behavior, we mean anything from reading upwards here, a basic making an inquiry, trialing a product, buying a product or a service, or it could be a campaign like Get Fit, Diet, Stop Smoking, Drive Safely, voting, all the way through to becoming an advocate or an activist. There's all these levels of behavior, and most campaigns, not all, some might only want awareness, but most campaigns and most business and organizational outcomes are behavioral orientated. They want stakeholders to behave in some way, okay? So the question then is for us, what generates behavior? Now there's three things, and I'll skip through the first two. The literature tells us and the research tells us that we got no chance of stimulating the kind of behavior we want if there's not, as one of the cornerstones, a basic level of satisfaction. Now this, in the case of products, will be product satisfaction, but if it's not a product marketing situation you're in, it could be just relationship satisfaction. Are we satisfied in our dealings with the organization? What this is telling us is if we don't have basic, or if our stakeholders don't have basic satisfaction, it's going nowhere. They're not going to behave the way we want. And interestingly, satisfaction is fairly well measured. You see it in customer sat, for example, in relationships studies. So we know that satisfaction is important. There's a second cornerstone that's vitally important according to psychologists, and that is trust. And again, it's described as a cornerstone of all relationships. And again, this is understood because we have reputation studies, and one of the key metrics measured in reputation studies is trust. You have things like the Edelman Trust Barometer. So I'm not telling you anything new there, but there's a gap in the middle of this model, which is important. So we're saying fundamentally we've got to have satisfaction, at least a basic level, and trust as cornerstones of any campaign to create behavior. But here's the interesting thing, and it shocked me when I first sort of started to study this. You can have well, first of all, if you don't have satisfaction and trust, forget it. You've got a problem, you've got to go away and you've got to build those because you ain't going to get the behaviors that you want. But here's the really interesting part. Even if you've got satisfaction and trust, there's no guarantee of behavioral change. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, now, just take a simple example. Let's say someone is buying a car. Let's say they bought a Honda. They've had a Honda for 4 or 5 years, 3 years. They're satisfied with it. They can be fully satisfied, go, yeah, it's a good car, no problems. Do you trust Honda? Yeah, they're a reliable company. Will you buy another Honda? And 9 times out of 10, or 5 times out of 10, I should say, people will say, well, it's been a good car, I trust the company, but you know, I'm going to try something else. This happens all the time. People can be satisfied and have trust, and they can do it with cars, banks, grocery shelves, products, and say, yeah, I'm happy there, but I think I'll try something else. Their behavior doesn't follow. So what's missing in this diagram, and here's the exciting part, the bit that drives behavior, building on those two, is when you've got engagement. If you've got satisfaction and you've got trust, essential cornerstones, you've got a faint chance of getting behavior, some chance, but when you add in engagement, when those stakeholders and customers are satisfied and trusting, and you create engagement, that is a trigger towards behavior. And I mean engagement in the way we've just discussed, that cognitive, psychological bond, emotional bond, and participation. And so participation, if you like, is happening along this border here, this edge between engagement and behavior. And one of the reasons people are really excited about social media is that it's not one-way mass transmission media. It actually facilitates engagement, two-way interaction. And that's one of the big excitements, because engagement is fundamental to achieving any form of business or organizational outcome. but engagement requires cognition, emotion, and participation. So the higher level engagements that we talk about, what does it look like? Yes, it could be comments, but it would have to be positive comments that are posted online. If people are writing positive things, particularly if they're expressing liking and emotions, it could be a sign of engagement. Linking could be, but getting higher up the scale, participating in events, people turning up. Very importantly, regular interaction. When people come back more than once, that's a very good sign of engagement. So looking at revisits and so on, if someone gets interactive with us and then never comes back, maybe they're unhappy. But when people regularly interact with the organization, and ultimately engagement is when people, the ultimate form could be collaboration, when stakeholders are actually collaborating in design, working on product councils. You're seeing some progressive companies do that. And I'll just throw it in a photograph there. Is a campaign I've been involved with is our National Day in Australia, Australia Day. And the campaign there is to try and get people not just to sit at home and think about it, but actually get active and participate. And when you look at that photograph and you look at those two faces and you look at they've painted their faces, they've turned up, they're in the park, they're celebrating, they're smiling, that's engagement. And you can have it physically and you can have it online. So engagement is one of the big important steps. It's not finally the outcome, to summarize, but it's an outtake. It's a key step between our outputs and getting towards outcomes. And usually you won't get outcomes without it. Engagement is that cognitive, emotional, and participatory involvement, and you want higher level engagement. The higher level engagement and participation you can get, the more likely people are to stay with you and follow you, and I mean follow you into buying your products or services and so on. So that's kind of some comments about engagement. It's an important area. I hope that makes sense. We're going to move on and talk about influence in a moment, but I might just pause there, Matt, and if there's any questions or you've got a comment.
Sure, Jim. When you talk about engagement and driving the passions of your audience, is content creation a function of engagement in terms of having a steady stream of content that brands can serve to their constituents, to customers and prospects? And does the content facilitate that engagement primarily?
Yeah, it's a good question, Matt. I think the last part of your question is the key. Content, the right kind of content, is essential to facilitate engagement. But content production itself is not engagement. It's an output, and it is important. It fits into that first stage that I'm not really talking about today. But we've got to produce content. We've got to produce not only press releases, but website content, social media content, video content. And if the content's dull and not relevant to the audience, you haven't got much chance of getting engagement. So content produce is important. I'm not sure I agree with the statement that content is king, though, or queen. That statement is often made in advertising and marketing, and I suspect that actually participation, engagement, and those things are more likely to be the king. But you've got to have good content. It's fundamental to engagement, because why else would people engage? And people engage, and things like emotion are important to remember. I emphasize not only cognitive, because when you think of emotion, your content may have lots of facts and figures, but does it have something to engage people emotionally? I mean, for example, is it fun? There's no harm in thinking, you know, it should be a bit of fun online. It can't be boring. So that's often tricky for corporations and government agencies to get their head around, that they spend their time with all the facts and figures, but you're not going to get engagement unless people are also somewhat emotionally involved. So you've got to tap pride or fear or memories or fun, or one of those emotional elements, and also then hopefully people will get involved and even let them produce some of the content. You know, that's where the participation comes in. You produce the basic stuff and say, hey, here, why don't you produce some content? And that really gets people involved.
Is it a matter of PR executives educating C-level execs that in order to achieve true engagement, the brands need to, quote, lose control to gain control?
Yeah, control's a difficult word. I'll be controversial and say we never ever had control. It's an illusion. We never control people's minds. We might control the message, and we spend a lot of time, particularly in the advertising industry, sitting around controlling the message, but we've never had any control over what people perceive, what they think, what they feel. So it's kind of an illusion. And if you want people to engage and participate, you can influence that, and that's the next thing we're going to move on to. The big one is influence, and engaging and influencing people, but I don't think we control them. And whenever you try to control people, trust me, from a psychological perspective, it ain't good for the relationship. If you try to control your husband or your wife or your children, look where it goes. It usually doesn't go real well. You try and control your customers, you try and control your stakeholders, they don't like it. They're going to walk away from you. Engage them, let them have a say, listen to them. So we're giving up control, but what we're getting back is engagement and participation. And I think that's far more valuable than a passive controlled audience. Shall we move on to influence? I think we had a segue there to touch on influence. And don't forget, type a question in if you've got one. There's a little box down the bottom of that panel on your screen. Influence is this is logical progression. Let's say we've got engagement. And I mentioned honestly that engagement's still not a business outcome. It's a vital ingredient to get towards that. So I kind of described it as an outtake. Influence is the next step down the road. So if you've got engagement, that engagement could be ineffective and negative. You want that engagement. In that engagement, you want to have influence, and you want to trigger other people to have influence towards what you want to achieve. Influence occurs when...
Good morning. Have your attention, please. The following will be a test of the building's emergency evacuation system. These alarms are for testing purposes.
Bear with me on this. It should stop in a moment. You're going to get beeps coming through here. This is, sorry about that, folks. I'm in a university building and we're having a fire test. Life is never boring. Sorry about that little disruption, but it's real life morning time here in Sydney, Australia. Influence occurs when someone's persuaded to change an opinion or a behavior that they otherwise would not have changed. So it's and it's an interesting one, influence, because they haven't yet actually done it. It's the moment when people move from engagement towards making that decision that they will possibly change their opinion or their behavior in line with what you want. So it's the next step on from engagement. Influence needs to be relevant because there's all kind of influence you can have and others can have. So what we're talking about with influence, and this is in terms of measurement, is we want to measure particular kinds of influence. It's not all influence. An organization may have huge influence, but you're interested in, are you influencing people towards a particular objective, in a particular campaign, or so on. It's also usually you want influence in relation to specific issues or topics. So if we're going to measure influence, influence is kind of a huge field. The way to make it manageable is to break it down and say, look, I'm only interested in influence in a couple of respects. It's relevant influence about this particular campaign on these particular topics. And so you're looking at a very specific kind of influence. Again, it manifests itself offline and online. The trick with influence is a number of people have looked for a magic formula like an influence score. And most of the work happening around the world at the moment on standards is, and we've talked to large companies, heads of research in big corporations, academics, lots of practitioners, is influence is different in every occasion. As I said, it's about each of you want to influence a particular stakeholder group on a particular issue. So a single influence score is very, very unlikely. What do we think influence might look like? Influence is, if you think of it as a step on from engagement. So at engagement, we've got people to the point of participating in some way. So influence is when their participation is extending to things like they're actually joining a group. So they're no longer just logging in and maybe commenting. They're actually joining an organization. They're supporting an organization. They're endorsing a product. They're seeking advice. They're subscribing to something. They could be trialing a product. So they haven't yet bought it, but they're at least trialing it. And I suppose you could say, well, what's the difference to engagement? influence, there has to be engagement in influence. Imagine these things, they dovetail in, they're not separate stages. So with engagement, we start to get cognitively engaged, emotionally engaged, then we start to get levels of participation that, you know, we could be following something and posting comments. Influence is when we are now at a point where we're making a more permanent decision about it, to join something, to support it, to subscribe, to trial a product with a view to buying it, and so on. So, you know, you can usually see influence in, for example, I've used the photograph from these particular protesters. Participation might have been in Egypt when they first turned up to a protest or they commented online, but when they were finally forming organizations and actually mounting a full-on campaign, they had influence. Their numbers were growing, so it was no longer just a mild level of participation and engagement. It was clearly influential, and it did lead to changes in government regimes. Question or comments on influence, Matt?
None right now.
Finally, talk a bit about, I guess you could say this is the real biggie. So picture this as a journey. These are not separate, discrete elements. They're a journey from producing information and reaching out to people through to having an impact or an outcome. And so this occurs beyond influence. So engagement is beyond the output, and then influence is further on from that. And the impact and the value, these are when actual desired behaviors are adopted after we've influenced people. Impact and value are tricky in that they can be positive returns, and generally they are positive returns. So they're things like sales, reputation gain, increases in membership, or improved fitness, or reduced road toll, whatever the objectives of a campaign are. It isn't necessary to recognize, though, that value can be a negative return, so risks avoided or costs saved. I recently looked at a campaign where a company had very low, or government department it was, had very low staff morale, and that was causing high turnover, and that was an actual significant cost to the organization. So then there was a major communication campaign, an employee reward scheme put in place, and a number of initiatives, and they saved $1 million in the cost of recruiting and retraining people. So there you would argue that that was $1 million saved, caused by a communication and employee engagement program. Impact and value. This is a really tricky area, and a couple of things to say about it. There's been argument now for decades about how do we value PR, and I'm not going to talk about advertising value equivalence today. We can have a question on that if you like, but worldwide, every single study has found that they are not a measure of value in any shape or form. In fact, they're kind of crazy because they're actually the advertising cost that is being compared, and yet we use the word value. So it's kind of the wrong end of the balance sheet, and they're not equivalent because you could have negative or neutral publicity. So you've got this term advertising value equivalence, and it's not a measure of value, it's a measure of what advertising would have cost, and it's not equivalent. So it's kind of invalid in many ways. One of the other ways, though, that has got more claim to legitimacy that is being used is ROI. So one question is, if we want to show impact and value to the business, ROI is business language. Can we have an ROI for PR and corporate communication? It's a tricky one, but there's recently been a fairly major study done worldwide, and it found a couple of problems for PR and corporate communication with ROI. And the thing with ROI is, most of us know, it is used as a financial accounting measure, and it's very well known as that. And so, as much as it's appealing in one sense that, okay, it gives us the language of the boardroom, the problem is it's seen as a financial accounting term, and when PR and corporate communication people use it, unless we are producing a specific financial number, then it causes confusion. A second thing that's important about this, though, that this study just found is, and this is where I think PR and corporate comms has got to lift our game, is that when we use ROI, we don't even calculate it correctly. Most people think return on investment is the dollars you get back versus the cost of doing the campaign, the operating cost. It's actually not true. ROI is the income as a ratio of capital expenditure. That's actually the financial and accounting term. And so what you have is PR using the term ROI, often not having an actual dollar amount, calculating it wrongly as a measure of return against OPEX, as we call it, operating expenditure, when it's actually a measure of return against CAPEX, or total CAPEX and OPEX. So that's problematic. And then thirdly, a lot of campaigns, a lot of corporate communication and PR people don't have a financial return. It's not relevant. They work for government or NGOs or non-profits, and their objectives, the value that they need to create, the impact, is something else. It might be driving safely. It might be getting fit and losing weight. It might be stopping smoking. It might be donating funds to, or donating blood, and so on. So ROI has been tantalizingly hung out as a potential measure. The general thinking is if you're able to generate and show a financial return against the total OPEX and CAPEX of your organization, fine. Use it, but use it correctly. What we advise is not using ROI and using it incorrectly, because that just runs as contrary to management language. Yes, Matt?
Jim, what role does employee communications play in boosting your brand's influence?
Well, I'll probably answer that in the next slide or two, and I've only got a couple to go. And I'll talk about a model of how you connect. And I tend to use logic models, because the bottom line, to answer your question in an overview, is that employee communication is not going to directly connect to sales or profits. But can it indirectly connect? Does it contribute up the line? And my argument is yes, it does. We've got to demonstrate that. And probably let me go on to the next bit, and I think we'll get to that.
Sure.
So ROI's got some question marks over it. It can be used, but shouldn't be wrongly used. So we can use KPIs and scorecards. The question with those is, the thing about a key performance indicator or a scorecard is you can put any measure of impact or value you like on that, as long as you agree with management on it. So what sort of things can go on there? And then the big question, the elephant in the room in all of this, is whatever you put as that ultimate impact and value of your campaign should be linked to the organization or business outcomes in some way. Easier said than done, and it doesn't always happen. Now, I'll give a couple of examples here. Linking PR outcomes to organization business outcomes. I'm just quickly putting up a few pictures of a campaign that was done in Australia, but very well known around the world in many places, because this campaign won the first ever PR award at CARMA. So it won the first global award as the world's best PR campaign a couple of years ago, and it's just been relaunched in its second iteration. Best job in the world, in a nutshell, was designed to promote tourism to the Great Barrier Reef and the tropical islands in North Queensland in Australia. And the campaign involved hardly any paid advertising at all. A few small display ads in the top, in the black and white photo there. And what they did is, though, they advertised to appoint a caretaker to live for 6 months on a tropical island. And this person was going to be selected from a worldwide competition, and their job was simply to record video and blog and talk about the places they went. And of course, the job application, they had thousands and thousands of applicants, worldwide media coverage. It won this huge award. The question at the end of the day, though, that was asked is, did it increase tourism numbers to that part of Australia? Because that was the ultimate objective. And funnily enough, this campaign that won the world's leading PR award, up to 2 years after it was done, they could not substantiate increased tourist numbers. So it didn't achieve the ultimate objective. Now, the problem there were mitigating factors. It turned out that the GFC happened to have effect along the way. That slowed down tourism. So when they analysed that there were some reasons for it, and they have since gone back and reanalyzed the numbers, and what they have found is, interestingly, when they broadened the data and they questioned people who came to Australia as tourists and maybe didn't go to the tropical islands but went somewhere else, they found that the campaign triggered a lot of visitors, not to the tropical island, but it made Australia prominent in their mind and they went somewhere else, so they had to improve their measurement. So the challenges with measuring that final connection are three. The ultimate outcome, the business outcomes, are what we call macro level. They're usually quite broad, whereas the PR activities are more micro. The outcomes are often well downstream. They may occur, a year or two later, so they're long term. And the other point is there's almost always the outcomes of the result of multiple inputs. And this is a key one. Things like this, getting more tourists to Australia, or it could be to Hawaii, or it could be to Florida, or wherever. If your objective was to get more tourists, the fact is economic conditions will be an influence. The fact is that airlines and discounts offered will be an influence. There'll be many other things influence that, not just your PR campaign. So how do you separate it out? The final thing I'll share with you today, and this is only a sample, is an approach to do that, and it goes back to Matt's question. It's about linking the PR and corporate comms outcomes to business outcomes and recognizing, being very blunt about it, and recognizing that organization and business outcomes are very macro level. So in this diagram I've suggested, for example, profit is a high-level business outcome. I've put another one in just to keep it interesting. Sustainability could be an ultimate outcome, should be in fact, because you could get profit in 1 year and then go broke the next year. Most organizations want profit if they're commercial, and certainly even government organizations and NGOs all want sustainability. Not just environmental, but sustainability of their organization. What this model technically is a logic model. What it's then saying is, starting at the top, okay, what does the organization want to achieve? And you'll see where I'm heading here in a moment. Then it asks the question, okay, what are the drivers of each of those ultimate outcomes? In the case of profit, for example, and these are just samples, it's clearly sales. Probably customer retention, because it's very expensive to get new customers. You'd rather keep the ones you got. Maybe you've got to control costs, and you've got to be developing good products. And right away you can see there that, in fact, those are not PR responsibilities. They're not corporate comms responsibilities, but they are fundamental things necessary to get profit. If you drill down, though, what causes sales? What drives sales? Well, product quality, brand awareness, the sales experience, but also product preference, people knowing about a product and preferring it over another. And I'll come back to a couple of those. If customer retention, product quality is going to affect that. Not our responsibility. We can't do that. Customer service is important, but also customer communication comes in. And I put a couple of these in red because I'm going to come back, because you're going to see that some of these drivers, PR and corporate communication, can contribute to or own. If we just flick to the other side of the diagram for a moment, sustainability, staff retention could be a key thing of sustainability. If you've got an organization and you've got high staff turnover, it's very difficult to sustain the profits, the culture, anything of the organization. So what drives retention? Morale and culture drives retention. What drives morale and culture? Well, recognition of staff, for example. More than pay and more than financial rewards, staff, we find from research, want recognition and respect. Pay and conditions sit somewhere further down. Triple bottom line thinking, community support, and so forth. My point then is to say, in this logic model, is we're simply saying organization business outcomes are very high level, and we're recognizing they've got multiple contributors. PR is just one of those, and often it contributes indirectly. So the logic of this model is that you identify not only the ultimate outcomes, but the sub-outcomes that underpin those outcomes. And we look at a two-step or a three-step flow. And so then what I do is, and I'm just flicking some overlays on, we may not drive profit, may not be responsible, but sales does, and quality does, and brand awareness does, but actually people knowing about a product and preferring a product, which often can come from product reviews and product publicity, and this is proven in research. I've got a study of sales reps who say that an independent journal article that compares products and rates one better than the other is more influential than advertising. So what I'm showing in the logic model there is that product publicity, even though it's down the line a little bit as a more micro activity, it connects to product preference, to sales, to brand, to sales, to profit. Likewise, if you're doing work in customer communication, that connects, oh, Mr. Narrow there, that connects to all the way through to customer retention, and customer retention is vital to profit. In staff morale, things like staff communications, newsletters, intranets, staff reward schemes, and so on it goes. So I'm just sharing with you a logic model that I've used with a few organizations in measurement. And what we can then do then is you can go and measure, for example, your product publicity, and you could use content analysis. And if you show you're placing the right messages and you're generating preference for a particular product through the tone, the sentiment, the favorability of that coverage, that connects through and is a driver of sales. And this model is designed to be openly developed and shared with management. I nickname it the toe bone to the foot bone, etc. model, ultimately connecting to the head bone. Now, to me, that's one of the ways that I know to link to outcomes. It would be good if we could say PR drives ultimate business outcomes directly with a line straight to it. I don't think that's realistic in the world, because many things drive those ultimate outcomes, many things. What we've got to do is show that what we do, those sub-outcomes, directly connect to and drive the ultimate outcomes. And then once management understands that, they're very happy for us to measure and evaluate the product publicity, the staff morale, the recognition, etc., and they can see that connection. So that's a little bit about ultimately in outcomes. We've talked a bit about engagement, its importance. I've given you a model to think about there. We've talked about influence as the next step along the line, and then ultimately the impact and the value. But I have had to contextualize that to say that it's very rare that PR and corporate communication could claim the total value or the total outcome at a high level, because that's usually owned by or contributed to by many people. But we've got to show where we had a place in it and a part in it. I'm happy to open it up and throw it to questions. And there's a question from Kate there. What role does employee communications play? I think we've... So if you go back to that, on that last question, I'd say employee communication, what does it do? Well, staff retention, staff morale and culture and motivation, these are important drivers, maybe not of profit, but they drive sustainability. Because if you make profit and then you've got high staff turnover, it's draining your profit and it's threatening your sustainability of that profit. So how you connect this up is up to you, but I would argue that on its own, employee communication doesn't matter on its own. It's only how it connects up. So do you have a staff retention challenge? Do you want to improve morale and culture? Do you want to build that? If you do, employee communication surely has to be a key driver, and therefore it fits into the organization somewhere around here in the diagram. Hope that makes some sense.
However, Jim, is the ultimate solution here, when we look at this organizational chart and PR helping to drive business outcomes, is the ultimate solution here that PR really has to be part of an integrated package in-house within the four walls, that there is true integrated communications, that their silos have legitimately been broken down, and PR is working hand in glove with developing these types of efforts, with advertising, with marketing, for example.
Yeah, that comes to a really key issue, Matt. Integration is both our friend and our enemy, and I'll explain that. Integration, when you integrate the PR and corporate communication in with advertising and direct and social media, all of those things, it is the way to go because it gets consistency of message. We know that most people need multiple touches of a message before they believe it. So it's very, very important to do that. The more you integrate, of course, though, the harder it is to see what the bit you did had the impact. So the more integrated, and that's the issue. What I'm showing in this chart here is that the organization, and that's only a small part of it, as a little sample, all organizations are highly integrated. And PR and corporate communication has to be integrated into the mix, but it does make it challenging. So what we normally suggest, though, at the micro level, at the planning level, make sure management understands where the things you do fit. So if you're doing employee communication, where does it fit? What's it designed to achieve? Is it designed to increase profit? Probably not. but it's designed to increase morale, retention, that saves the organization money, that creates sustainability, and that in turn is important to profit. If management accepts that, then you measure staff morale and culture to show, and staff communications to show that you achieved the desired effect at that level. So you still need to keep the identification of the bits you do, and that's no different to the challenge of, say, I'm not sure why we're hung up about this, because this is no different to the accounts department, the HR department, the legal department. If you're a lawyer or you're an accountant, how does what you do in the accounts department contribute to the ultimate goals of the organization? It doesn't directly. If you're sitting there doing the invoices or the financial monthly returns. But if you can show that that's vital to efficient management of the organization, and without efficient management the organization will lose money, then you're showing that your bit connects. So I think we get very sort of oversensitive to the fact that we can't prove that PR, is responsible for the total outcome of the organization. Well, not even the CEO can prove that. If the CEO had to do this and show what his value is to the organization, a good CEO, she or he has an effect. They can affect share price, but they're not the only factor. They're only one element. And PR is one. What we've got to show is that we're a key element. And where do we fit? And how do we connect?
And what are some of the ways that PR can do that in the sense of distinguishing PR under the rubric of integrated communications?
Well, an example, let me take, evaluation can be done at a micro and a macro level. And just to explain that a bit further, let's take the example of product publicity as one example. So if you're in the organization's ultimate goal is profit. To get there, it's got to have sales. If it's agreed that you're going to produce product publicity and try and get favorable product publicity and positive product comparisons to say your product is good, at the micro level, if management agrees that product publicity is an activity to do, the micro level measurement is to do content analysis, and that content analysis it's necessary because you might be getting publicity, but it may be negative, or the competitors may get more. So your content analysis is going to show whether you've got the right messages into that content, whether you beat the competitors, what share of voice you got, and so on. So I call that the micro level of management. You must do it. At the macro level of management, there's a second thing you can do, and that is when the organization does brand surveys or does reputation surveys or even surveys of its customers, then try to get a question inserted that asks those people why they bought the product. And this often takes a little bit of work. So at the micro level, we tend to measure okay, but we forget to try and measure at the macro level. Get involved in those customer surveys, get involved in those reputation surveys, and get some extra questions inserted. Because recently I got involved in a customer SAT survey, and there was no questions about PR. And so we begged and pleaded to say, okay, if you're surveying customers, just ask them a question about when they were buying their product last time, what were the major influences? What were the things that most influenced them? And ask them to rank things. And we gave them a question that said you can rank from 1 to 10, advertising, trialing, testing the product, etc., etc. Product reviews in magazines and newspapers. And guess what? They ticked number 2 in their average preference, the editorial product reviews. So that's the macro. So what we then found is at a content analysis level, the PR people got the right kind of publicity. And then at the macro level, once a year or so, we were able to verify, just with one question, that one of the key reasons that people were buying that product was because of those product reviews. There's the connection. And that's why I call it the toe bone to the foot bone to the leg bone to the backbone to the head bone.
And did that in turn generate higher PR budgets?
It can do. It depends on management. I find this logic model approach is usually very educational to management, because a number of times I go into an organization and have done over the years and find that management intuitively, and interestingly, and it's very positive in this sense, management, most of them intuitively understand PR is important because they've had experiences in their life like crises. They intuitively understand. But actually, most of them don't have a clue on a day-to-day basis where PR and corporate comms fits. They know it's intuitively important, but they don't really get what it does. So I usually do this logic model and let them tell me what their ultimate goals are, and then let them work out with me what the sub-outcomes are, what do you need to do to achieve those things. And then as we start to work it down, you say to them, well, is positive product publicity important? Is customer communication important? And they start going, oh, yeah, it really is. Okay, well, PR can do that. If it does that, do you agree it's important? Yes, it is. And so you've got to show them where it fits. But I have had cases where the particular case I was mentioning was Volkswagen in Asia. And Volkswagen did a survey of customers who had purchased in the past 6 months. And they found that the most influential element on sales, final sales decision, was, not surprisingly, test drives and customer and showroom experience. But number 2 was independent editorial. And advertising was about number 6 on that list. When we asked another question and said, where did you become aware of this product? To be fair, advertising was number 1, and editorial was about 4 or 5. But even there, we could show that editorial publicity was contributing to awareness, but it was a key factor in the ultimate preference decision. And so we did that by combining content analysis at the micro level and then 2 questions inserted in a customer survey once every 2 years. And they did get an increased budget for PR.
Okay. Do we have any other questions from attendees?
I'd hate to make this sound like it's a magic formula. It's not. You know, this is hard work, and I guess this is why, you know, professionals have been struggling with this for a long, long time. It ain't easy, but you know, I think that looking through, really understanding things like logic models and working through with clients to educate them and employers to understand these connections. Because I had a client recently who just didn't understand why they had to do any community support. And he said, well, we don't have any factories out in communities, we don't have any mines. And, you know, so we went out and we did a little bit of homework, and we found that there were some community groups, and those community groups were heavily connected to some activist groups, and they were heavily connected to the government, and they were in turn contributing to a call for regulation of some of their products. So we drew it out as a logic model and said, the driver for this push for regulating you, here's where it's coming from, here's the source. It's coming right out of these communities. If you want to have a dialogue and you want to address this, you need to get out and talk to those communities. And they didn't understand that. They'd never seen that before. And we did that by a logic model. It sort of went down, 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 and eventually found the source that was driving that push for regulation. They were running around using lawyers at the government level, but that wasn't going to stop the source. And we've showed them that community relations and communication at the community level could make a major contribution.
Okay, and with that, we're just about out of time, unless there are any questions in the couple of minutes we do have left.
Matt, I've got a list of about 9 questions here from people that are that have posed to you. I don't think we'll be able to get to all of them, but I can pick out 1 or 2, and then Jim, I can email the rest to you to answer to people.
Yeah, happy to. Throw in a couple quickly now, and I'll see if I can quickly comment.
Okay. One I've got is from Rose Davis. She asks, if ROI doesn't work for government agencies, what can we use to demonstrate our value?
Well, government, it goes back to the logic model. Government agencies will have objectives as well. It could be related to public transport or health. I'm working with government departments that are trying to improve health in areas like healthy aging, fitness, and so it in a way doesn't matter. That macro level objective, it's working out what it is and then working out the sub-outcomes. So if the government agency is trying to, I've also done work with the tax office, so if the government agency is trying to more efficiently collect tax or stop tax evasion, then that's the ultimate metric. What's the sub-outcome? What do you need to do to achieve that? Well, you need a lot of things. You need simple forms. You need penalties. But you probably also need information. You need explanations for people. How many people are misdoing their tax because they're confused? And what you've got to do is, whatever the ultimate outcome is, work out in your own mind. It's a useful exercise for us to do, is what exactly can we contribute that links to the sub-outcomes that will underpin the ultimate outcome, and identifying that and explaining it to management. And so that's why ROI doesn't always work, because a lot of organizations have non-financial outcomes. You know, anything from road safety to health communication to winning an election. You know, there's so many, paying tax on time, and they're all the objectives that we're trying to achieve. The question is for us is how can PR make a contribution? Got time for one more?
Yeah, there's one more. Let's see. Okay, from Melissa Tedesco. How do you drive behavior change when you are in a low engagement category where it is difficult to drive high-level engagement, let alone low-level engagement?
That's a hard question. I probably have to think of an example or a specific. If you're only able to drive low level of engagement, there is a low probability of that connecting to behavioral change. That's true. The only thoughts I got without knowing a specific example would be working out what are the higher level things that drive that behavior. Are they totally beyond your control, or can you form partnerships or alliances? Is there other groups or other influences that you can work with? Would be one thought I had. Because if you're not able to exercise all of the chain, and this is the logic model at work again, sometimes in the logic model you go sideways. You can't directly upwards contribute, but you go sideways, build an alliance, and that alliance or that partnership may be able to exert some influence. But I'd probably happy to take an email question if there's a particular example that I'm not really covering.
Okay, thanks, Jim. And just a reminder to all the attendees, if we didn't get to your questions, you'll get an email response from us.
Do we make the slides available, Katie?
Yes, they will all be available. The slides and the recording should be available tomorrow. It's whenever GoToWebinar is able to process the whole recording.
Yeah, I can send you an update. I've made a few minor changes, so do you want me to send you an updated version? I'm happy for anyone to have the slides.
Sure thing. I'll post that too. For anybody who's interested in a recording of the webinar and the PowerPoint deck, we are going to post it at CARMA, CARMA.com/BLOG. It's our blog.
And a big thanks to Jim today for hosting the webinar and providing us with all this insight into PR measurement. Jim, thanks for the time.
I hope it's useful. Thank you all, and good luck with it.
Thanks, everybody.